Welcome. I hope you are having a wonderful night, dear viewer. Tonight, I will be telling some terrifyingly scary stories. Make sure to leave your feedback on the comments so I can make this the best experience for you. And if you have any stories you would like me to tell, you can send them through the link in the description. Let's begin. Story 1. In the early 80s, I lived in Okinawa, Japan. My dad thought that seeing the world would be an adventure that would help my brother and I become better men, and I have to say, I think he was right. Being in the military showed me cultures many would never get to experience, and I am thankful for every experience that life gave to me, even the scary ones. While we lived in Japan, my father wanted us to have a fully immersive experience, so he chose to move us into a small Japanese neighborhood off base. We lived in a little house at the top of an enormous hill in a cul-de-sac that overlooked, I kid you not, part of a huge zoo, and on one side, a fairly large cemetery. Our particular house was set far above the monkey habitats, about a mile downhill. Between us and those habitats was nothing but thick Indiana Jones-style jungle. Jungle the neighborhood kids and I would tromp through endlessly, ignoring the local warnings about poisonous snakes and ancient untripped mines from World War II. We were the only American family living in that cul-de-sac, completely surrounded by Japanese families, and it was amazing. The kids loved us, and although we couldn't communicate through language very well, we understood each other perfectly. Well, most of the time. Opposite us was an older couple with a lush garden surrounding their property. The older woman wanted us to call her Mama-san, and she had us helping her garden whenever she could coax us over with green tea and chocolate bean and cookies. We loved her. She was so welcoming and generous, as was everyone else actually. We lived in a wonderful neighborhood. The only drawback to Mama-san's home, however, was that she directly overlooked the cemetery. And that cemetery was unlike any cemetery I had ever seen before, because Okinawa is an island. Burials don't happen very often. Instead, above-ground crypts are built. Many of them built into the sides of the hills that make up the island. The crypts are large, made of huge arcs of polished stone, set over a large square of that stone, which has a square insert cut into the middle of it for the coffin to be placed inside. Once inside, the square is inset with another piece of polished stone just inside, leaving a kind of shelf on the outside so offerings could be made to lost loved ones. Yen, food, flowers, incense are some of the offerings given. Below Mama-san's house was a valley that swooped back up into another hill, opposite her home. That valley and both hills were covered with these crypts and spider webbing up and down. Through the crypts were various stone step pathways that were old and badly maintained. It was quite a sight. One evening, Mama-san asked me to come visit with her alone. She had something to show me, but it was only for me as the older brother. Intrigued and a bit proud, I agreed. She took me to the back of her garden and sat me on a thick wooden bench that was carved with scenes of fishermen and men with swords, and told me she had a story to tell. Mama-san then disappeared for a few minutes, and soon returned with a tray that held hot green tea and sweet rice cakes. Sitting next to me, she smiled and commented on the colors of the evening sky as the sun began to lower. Mama-san said she had seen me, my brother, and some other kids daring each other to follow a stairway path down into the cemetery. You have to understand, the path from our little home area down to the cemetery consisted of hundreds of steps, many broken or cracking, in and out of bushes, and at a steep incline. It would be dangerous for anyone, but the real test was seeing how long we could take walking through the crypts at night. Mama-san wanted to explain why that was a bad idea. Many years ago, during the war, Americans were thought to be devils, monsters that would murder innocent citizens for no reason other than to kill. That fear was the product of wartime propaganda used to encourage young men to military service and farmers to fight alongside them. But many didn't. Many ran. And with nowhere to go, nowhere to hide, hundreds of Japanese citizens hurled themselves off of a cliffside rather than face torture at the hands of their perceived enemy. I was terrified at hearing this. I had no idea this had happened. I was mortified and hit with such sadness, I started to cry. The sun was setting and the sky went from pink and blue to a deep orange and red. Mama-san reached out and held my hand, telling me not to worry. This was in the past, and the past is something we must always remember. So we never go back. She went on with her story. One young woman had followed through with this sacrifice with her 2 children, but she survived the fall. She was in a coma for months. When she did regain consciousness, she was horrified to realize she was not with her children. They had been buried somewhere in that cemetery below, in an unmarked crypt that held many others. The woman would spend days and nights searching the cemetery, crying in pain, the torment of her loss unbearable, until the day she threw herself into the ocean to hopefully be reunited with her lost family. But they say she never found her children. Her act of suicide doomed her to purgatory. She would remain tortured for eternity. The sun had disappeared, the cemetery drowned in inky blackness, the main path dotted with dim broken lights, feebly illuminating small areas. Mama-san continued. She still wanders the cemetery, she said, looking for her kids. You can hear her crying. And then she pointed down. I didn't want to, but I did. I looked. In the back of the cemetery, in the darkness, there was a white figure, at first a bright white shimmer, moving slowly, kind of shaking. It moved from side to side like it was moving among the crypts, and you could actually hear the crying, softly at first, but then low moans and whimpers of pain as it got closer. I was terrified. I wanted to run, but Mama-san held my hand and whispered that she wouldn't come up here. We were too far, but that is why we shouldn't go down there after dark. She said many don't know her story and call her the White Witch, which angers her. It's best to stay away. It's best to pray for her. Mama-san said she comes out to see her often, hoping one day she will find her salvation. Needless to say, I never went down to that cemetery. Not once. And I never sat back there with Mama-san again either. That was enough for me. I did, however, visit Suicide Hill. It's called Peace Prayer Park, now out of respect. I cried the whole time we were there. I prayed for all the souls and for forgiveness. So many Japanese citizens spoke to us, welcoming us, telling us stories, sharing with us. I didn't feel worthy, and my love for the country and its people was overwhelming. I'll never forget my time there. I'd like to go back to see if she's still there, wandering the graves, looking for her children. Story 2. I bought my first house in 2003, and I couldn't have been happier. It was a dream come true for me. However, shortly after moving in, I was introduced to a rather peculiar topic by 2 of my new neighbors, the ghosts that supposedly haunted my house. At first, I thought they were just teasing me, so I played along, pretending that I had seen the ghost and that it was no big deal. Little did I know that this was just the beginning of a strange and unsettling journey. As the summer went on, I got to know more of my neighbors, and to my surprise, they all brought up the same subject, the ghost in my house. It became a recurring theme in conversations, and I couldn't help but feel intrigued and slightly unnerved. Seeking some answers, I turned to an elderly woman on the block who had always been kind and friendly towards me. I knew she wouldn't play tricks on me, which is why I decided to ask her about the ghost. After I inquired, she began recounting a chilling story about the previous owner of my house. Apparently, the previous owner had purchased the home, but never actually lived in it because she claimed it was haunted. The house was plagued by strange sounds at night. Footsteps, sobbing, and some had even glimpsed a man sitting in the kitchen, covered in blood. As the woman continued her tale, it sent shivers down my spine. To add to the eerie atmosphere, one of my neighbors who had assisted with the house renovations shared his own unsettling encounter. While putting up drywall, he felt an inexplicable force lift his dreadlocks. It was a hair-raising experience that left him deeply unsettled. Now, I must admit that I had encountered paranormal phenomena before, although it had been quite a while. Over time, I had come to dismiss those experiences as mere night terrors, attributing them to my overactive imagination. However, the stories surrounding my new home began to make me question my skeptical stance. One day, I visited a small neighborhood video store to rent a movie. As I filled out the necessary forms, providing my demographic information and credit card details, the owner took notice of my address and exclaimed, "Oh my God, you live in that house." Naturally, I was taken aback and asked her to explain further. She went on to tell me that her former employee had tragically taken his own life in my house. When she learned of his death, she hurried to the scene, only to find the house cordoned off by the police as a potential crime scene. According to her account, he had just moved in with his partner and wanted to invite his mother over to meet his significant other and come out to her. However, his mother, upon hearing the news, disowned him over the phone, even though she already knew he was gay, adding to the weight of his emotional turmoil. He received a letter that same week from an IV testing center, revealing that he had tested positive for the virus. At that time, an HIV diagnosis was often considered a death sentence. Overwhelmed by despair, he sat alone at the kitchen table, ate a bowl of cereal, and ended it. The video store owner shared with me that ever since that tragic event, she had experienced numerous paranormal occurrences in her store. Videos would fly off shelves and even levitate in the air, leaving her bewildered and frightened. Meanwhile, in my own house, I primarily encountered auditory phenomena. A symphony of sounds at night, including the distinct noise of Cheerios being poured into a bowl, despite the fact that I never ate cereal. Sobbing could also be heard emanating from the kitchen, often waking me from my sleep. In the midst of this haunting ordeal, I found solace in the words of my grandmother, who had once told me, when the dead come to you, they want something. Perform an act of charity in their name and pray for them. Inspired by her wisdom, I decided to take action. One night, I sat down at the very kitchen table where the tragic suicide had occurred, lit a candle, and spoke to him. I promised that each night I would recite a novena prayer for him, dedicating it to his lost soul. During the 9th night of the first novena, which I had chosen to recite to St. Anthony, the patron saint of lost souls, something remarkable happened. I heard uncontrollable sobbing, a profound presence of grief and despair. The sound of hyperventilating breathing filled the room, as if someone were struggling to catch their breath. Yet, despite the intensity of the moment, I knew deep within that this presence was not malevolent. It was a connection forged in intimacy and compassion, a connection he desperately needed. For the next 45 days, I continued to recite the novena prayer, faithfully lighting a candle in his honor. Additionally, I arranged for a mass to be said in his name. Throughout this period, there were occasions when I woke up to feel his presence standing over my bed. However, I never felt threatened. Instead, I sensed a certain peace emanating from his spirit. To this day, I occasionally experience his presence, although with diminishing frequency. The haunting has subsided, gradually fading into the realm of memory. As time goes on, I can't help but wonder if my acts of compassion and prayer played a role in easing his restless soul. Regardless, this unique encounter with the supernatural has forever left its mark on me, reminding me of the power of empathy and the mysteries that lie beyond our earthly existence. Story 3. So let me start out by saying I enjoy writing, so this will be long, but will hopefully be an interesting read. I also admit that I have absolutely no memory of this experience. I was a little over 2 years old and just starting to walk on my own when this event took place. My mom only told me this story around 3 years ago when I was 32 and about to get married. My mother was raised in a very tiny fundamentalist Christian community and had no belief in the paranormal. She believed that our souls sleep until Judgment Day or something like this. Ergo, there are no ghosts or spirits to haunt houses. Even over 30 years later, She still sounded terrified as she told me this. This woman who always talks way too loud was literally whispering by the end of it, and she was white as a sheet. I believed her completely and still do. In 1988, my parents had their second child. This was my brother Victor. We were very crowded in our rented flat with 2 babies. My parents decided to move to a rambling old 2-story farmhouse on a 7-acre plot in southern Ohio for more room for the family. It was way out in the sticks and took almost an hour to get to town from there. My mom said the first time I saw the house, I freaked out. I was crying and saying things like, "Don't like mean house. Mean house. Ugly house don't like. Scary house mama. Don't like. Scary house mama. Don't like." My mom says this behavior was very out of character for me, but I stopped complaining about the house after a few weeks, so she chalked it up to the stress of the movie. Now this house was ramshackle as hell and in the middle of nowhere. The kitchen was to the far rear of the house, and until recently, before we moved in, still had a working ancient wood-burning cooking stove against the back wall. This had caught the back wall on fire a couple of months before we moved in and caused a lot of damage. A lot of this damage wasn't fixed, so my young, broke parents got a very cheap rent agreement. On the second floor, directly above the kitchen, was a locked room. The landlord claimed it had heavy fire damage, but her son, who had done the repairs, claimed the only fire damage left was in the kitchen since it had been the worst and was beyond his skill level to fix. Either way, the landlord was adamant that the room was off limits, and my parents always respected that. I know all this because I heard stories about the crappy farmhouse with the creepy door my whole life, and there were pictures of us in and around the farmhouse. The locked door was right next to the upstairs landing, so there was no avoiding it, and both my parents have told me it gave them the chills. A few months after we moved in, my mother and I were in the yard with our pit bull Doberman mix, Boss. She was hanging laundry, and I was rolling around with the dog. She said that just as she noticed that everything was way too silent, Boss started going crazy from surprisingly far away. About 500 yards from the house on the left, there was a small duck pond. Boss was in between the two, running towards my mom, then turning and running back towards the pond, barking frantically the whole time. My mom saw something thrashing around in the middle of the pond, that something was me. She took off towards the water full speed. Boss beat her there and dragged me out of the water himself. Although my mom was confused how I got so far so fast and how I got into the center of the pond, since it was over my head, and I couldn't swim, she figured she underestimated me and brought in the baby gates and playpens. I was to be contained from now on. A few weeks later, she was cooking downstairs. Boss was outside, Victor asleep in his crib, and I was in my playpen in my room upstairs. I also had a gate on my door and one at the top of the stairs. The stairs ran up from the side of the kitchen, so my mom said she could listen for us crying or fussing while cooking. My mom said no longer than 15 minutes after the last time. She looked in on us kids. Boss starts going crazy again in the yard. She runs up to check on us. Victor's still sleeping. Every baby gate is still shut and locked. But I am not in my room. A frenzied search reveals I'm not in the house at all. A sudden image of Boss saving me from drowning causes my mom to rush outside to see what he's trying to tell her this time. She said he was running circles in the yard, barking uncontrollably. When she got outside, he took off towards the right, away from the pond. He would run ahead, turn around and bark at my mother, wait for her to catch up a little before racing off again. He ended up leading her almost a mile and a half, out onto the dirt road that separated our property from our neighbors. He led her to a thick stand of trees on our neighbor's side of the rocky drive. She said what hit her first was the foul stench of advanced decay. She plowed into the trees with her heart in her throat and her stomach full of ice. She said she noticed many piles of corrugated tin, tarps, tires, and other debris. The miasma was emanating most strongly from these junkyard cairns. Peeking under a sheet of tin, she discovered the extremely decomposed corpse of a butchered cow. As she headed deeper into the thicket, where the tree cover was denser, she said less care was taken to cover the remains. Grisly pieces of bones and rotted chunks of bovine littered the area. Apparently, our neighbor, in an effort to cheat his taxes, had been illegally slaughtering cattle and hiding the remains in one of the few thick stands of trees around. She found me in the dead center of this thicket, just standing there looking around like I was confused. Surrounded by carnage, she said I didn't seem scared or anything, just standing. She rushed over to me and, after ascertaining that I wasn't injured, began questioning me on why I was here, how I got there, etc. Keep in mind that although my mother said I started speaking very young, I still didn't have much of a vocabulary. She said I told her, with that serious look only small children can give, that the children brought me here, terrified at the thought that anyone, even children, could walk right past her through the kitchen, get me from upstairs and walk right back past her on the way down the stairs and out with me. She demanded to know what children and where the hell they are now. I looked at her dead, serious, and told her the ones that live with us in the room at the top of the stairs, and that I didn't see them anymore. After a moment of stunned silence, she started asking all kinds of questions about these children. However, she told me that I refused to say anything else. She said as long as she questioned me about what happened, I would just stand there staring at her with a serious expression and my mouth closed. She said this same pattern held true every other time she brought it up to me. So she was always left wondering and immediately began hounding my dad about moving closer to town. While the incident with me getting to the pond was highly unlikely, it was at least remotely possible. My mother is adamant that me being in the hidden slaughter yard that day was flat impossible. She says there is no way I could have even known it was out there, much less have the ability to open and relock the baby gates, get downstairs, past her, and end up almost 2 miles down the road, and in this place in under 15 minutes. I was only 2 and as slow and clumsy as most toddlers. As I said, she is still shaken by it after 30 years. Personally, I have no idea what happened that day. I've thought about hypnosis but haven't yet decided. I really want to remember. Maybe it's better to let it be a mystery, because whatever those things were, I really don't think they were children.